Hello Mzansi, you're listening to Farmers Inside Track, proudly brought to you by Food for Mzansi. Officially, this is the world's best podcast for 2024, as awarded by WAN EFRA, the global organization for the world's press. I am your host, Patricia Tembo. Welcome to episode 443. Today we're discussing a very unique crop. Alec Yardley, production supervisor at Karoo Bioscience, will be discussing medicinal cannabis. This episode is set to be informative and practical as we unpack market opportunities, cultivation management, and the legal considerations associated with medicinal cannabis. Thank you so much for joining us on Farmers Inside Track. We're very excited to have your insights about cannabis cultivation. But to start off, can you just let us know more about what you do? I know that you are a production supervisor at Karoo Bioscience, so maybe just tell us a little bit more about your scope of work.
Thank you for having me. We are a company that works in the medicinal cannabis industry. Basically, we cultivate the plant for its medicinal purposes. My role is in charge of the sort of production and cultivation side of the business. Together with a team of 15 guys, we oversee everything from little seedlings all the way through to the harvest process. And yeah, that's kind of a short summary of what we do and everything in between.
Thank you. Just to familiarize the audience a little bit more about cannabis cultivation and myself, because I'm excited to learn from you today. Can you just tell us about medicinal cannabis and what is it used for? Is it something that someone can venture into in terms of creating an enterprise?
A lot of people are probably unsure of what the difference is between medicinal cannabis and hemp. Medicinal cannabis is sort of grown for its medicinal properties. And when I say that, I mean the THC and the CBD, many other compounds within the plant that have medicinal properties that in turn actually help alleviate pain, chronic illnesses, and other sort of ailments. It used to be quite a controversial plant, but with the legalization and the global adoption of it worldwide, it kind of shows that the world is opening up to natural alternative medicines. We're growing to supply that industry, the medicinal aspects of the plant. It's the THC and the CBD. And then a few other compounds within the plant that help alleviate certain symptoms and treat patients worldwide.
I'm actually quite curious to know how you got into the industry. How did you know about it?
So obviously, it's a very new industry. You can probably see there's not a lot of information about it, but it does pop up every now and again on the news. I got into contact with some friends and they were running this facility out in the Plain Karoo Bioscience. I think they're one of the first facilities to have popped up here. Because it's a plant, my background in agriculture really helps to sort of fill in that area of expertise within the cultivation side. It's still a very new industry, but the global adoption is increasing and, more and more markets are opening and people are opening up and to understand a bit more about the plant.
What are the requirements for starting a cannabis cultivation operation? How would you go about starting that?
It's not exactly the easiest thing. Starting a medicinal cannabis cultivation operation in South Africa involves quite a detailed understanding of the legal and operational requirements, I'd say. And when I talk about legal, I'm talking about the licensing. So in order to cultivate medicinal cannabis, you need a license, obviously. And that license is regulated by the SAHPRA, or the South African Health Products and Regulatory Authority. And so basically it's quite a stringent application because at the end of the day, you are growing a medicine. And so in order to fit in that category, it does require a lot of quality and quality control. On top of that, your facility does need to comply with good manufacturing standards, ensuring that basically your cultivation, your processing and your distribution meet like your international quality standards. On top of that, because it's a medicine, you'll probably need to implement quite some comprehensive security measures because it is a high value crop. So that's sort of the legal requirements you probably need to take into account before setting up a facility. On top of that, the facility itself, you'd want to go with a good location with suitable climate, obviously access to utilities like it is in most agricultural operations, water, sunlight. On top of that as well, there's certain equipment that you're going to need to sort of get this operation going. Things like HVAC systems, clean rooms for processing, secure storage. It's quite a hefty list of things to go through, but it's not impossible. There is facilities popping up left, right, and center at the moment in South Africa because we do offer the perfect climate and conditions for this. I think it's a very interesting industry to be in at the moment, and it's exciting to see where it's going to go.
I find that quite interesting. There are very stringent measures and regulations. It's quite a controlled industry. Which you did mention that you have to be very strict about security because it's a high value crop. Have you had any incidences?
Not as of yet, and that I'm grateful for. Security is one of the top priorities in this sort of setup. Luckily, we have not had any incidents yet, but you never know what can happen. And that's why it really matters.
Can you explain the ideal medium for cannabis cultivation? I know you grow it in soil, but hydroponics, is that an option someone could go into in terms of cultivating medicinal cannabis?
In terms of the growing medium, so obviously soil, specifically living soil, seems to be quite a popular thing at the moment. It's sort of where you pre-fertilize the soil with organic amendments so that the soil kind of holds all the nutrients and the microbial content. And once that's set up, it really requires minimal input. So I think that's one of the quite popular mediums. Then obviously you mentioned hydroponics. Hydroponics is a really cool way of going about it. It allows you to have really precise control over the nutrient delivery, the water, the pH, the EC, all those sort of cool things. And funny enough, it has a good water efficiency. So you'd think obviously growing with hydroponics is a lot of water and you're wasting water. But if you're using the right system, like a closed loop system, you're recirculating water. And instead of standard commercial operations where you use a lot of water and then the water is running off and that's that, in the hydroponic system, you're actually reusing the same water, which is quite efficient. So that's quite a cool way to go about it, but it is quite complex and it's got quite a high cost. So that's probably something you'd want to take into consideration. Also, two other very popular growing mediums are rockwool and coco coir. Coco coir, I'm sure you're quite familiar with. It's used in quite a few operations like tomatoes, cucumbers and whatnot. Then rockwool is also quite a sterile medium and very good for water retention. I'd say like the four main growing mediums that are being used at the moment, to my knowledge.
The crop itself, what are the stages? Explain the growing stages of this crop.
When it's grown outside in the natural environment as a wild species, the plant takes roughly 6 months to grow. What we're doing is we're taking that, we're putting it into a controlled environment and we're reducing that to half the time, so roughly 3 months. Within the plant cycle, there's the seedling phase or the clonal phase, the vegetation or vegetative stage, and then the flowering phase, as with many other plants. So very similar. The clonal/seedling phase is probably roughly between a week to 2 weeks. And then the vegetative growth, depending on what your goals are and what you want to achieve, that roughly takes around 3 to 4 weeks. And then your flowering stage is your longest stage, which is roughly around 8 weeks of growth. And at the end of that, you should be sitting with a nice big plant.
So you're looking at about 3 months, 4 months of cultivation. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's a pretty quick cycle for one to have. Would South Africa's sort of climate be suitable for growing this crop in terms of, temperature and the light exposure? Tell me about the light. I've heard that there are certain crop species that are more sensitive to light compared to others. So tell me a little bit more about cannabis in this instance.
Cannabis is one of those plants that are photoperiod sensitive. So basically what that means is that it senses the changes in light. So when the seasons change from summer to autumn and winter, the hormones and the other compounds within the plant sense that and they shift towards flowering. So what we basically do is in the vegetative stage, we give the plants roughly between 16 to 18 hours of straight light with about 6 hours of darkness. That keeps the plant in a vegetative state and it continues focusing on growing branches and branching out and building a good structure. Once you put that into the flowering phase, you can bring the amount of hours under light down to like around 12 hours. So 12 hours light, 12 hours darkness. And what that effectively does is that it allows the plant to turn its focus towards developing its flowers, which are the product that we actually after. We want nice, big, good quality flowers. So that is why the flowering phase is also one of the longest phases to really develop those flowers and get good quality out of it. So yeah, in terms of the climate in South Africa, it's very ideal. It's one of the few places around the world that offer probably some of the best conditions in the world. And I think that's probably why the market is growing and it is developing. It's because people are seeing the possibilities. The light is not an issue at all. We've got really great summers. And then in terms of all the environmental factors like temperature, humidity, we have quite a range of biomes and geographical regions within the country that suit different growing styles and different cultivars, because different cultivars obviously require different sort of temperature and environmental requirements. a short summary, I think South Africa is really great in terms of its environmental conditions.
And now you just mentioned cultivars. Maybe explain the cultivars, like what to look for, what is conducive for someone looking to grow medicinal cannabis.
Strain selection is really dependent on what the market wants and what the customer wants. And we combine that with what grows best in our setup. So when I talk about what the customer wants, it's really in terms of what I mentioned earlier, the THC and the CBD content. And right now, the main focus is to really develop a good THC content. So we take those sort of compounds of the plant and we combine that with its structure, ability to grow in our sort of setup, sort of resistant to pests and diseases, and sort of criteria. You'll have a clear winner that stands out to you.
With the previous question, you mentioned how, I think you said it's 6 hours of darkness for the vegetative growth stage. That's quite interesting to me because, we have a 24-hour cycle and it's definitely more than 6 hours of nighttime or darkness. How do you manage that?
In terms of growing the plant, there's different setups you can go for. The quite common setup is a hybrid sort of growing environment that combines a greenhouse sort of polycarb setup with supplemental lighting. So you're getting natural sunlight and you're also getting extra light from your lights. What that allows you to do is also then when you want to mimic 18 hours of light, which is not easy, you can keep the lights running when it gets dark. When you want 6 hours of darkness, we have these things called blackouts. What they do is they close the ceiling and prevent any light from coming into the room. So essentially in the flowering phase, you've got 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness. Now in summer, we know there's more light than dark. And so the sun comes up at around 5, but you need more hours of darkness. So we close those blackouts and those blackouts eventually prevent any light from entering the greenhouse. And then in winter, when there's more hours of darkness than light, we can use the supplemental lighting to keep the lights on in the flowering rooms and really allow the plants to get that 12 hours.
What common pests and diseases that affect this crop? Because obviously pests and diseases is inevitable in any sort of cultivation or crop, when even just animal rearing. Let us know the different diseases that you might encounter with this crop.
It's quite the common insects you would find in most crops. We get aphids, thrips, fungus gnats. Those are quite the common ones you'll find in cannabis. Luckily, we haven't found a lot of those yet. Each environment is different and some environments allow for those insects to thrive. On top of that, diseases, I think quite a common one is powdery mildew. And that, I think, if you remember, is not only in cannabis, but in quite a wide range of crops, does affect a lot of plants. And then also botrytis or bud rot also has quite an impact on the plant in its flowering towards the end of its life cycle. Root rot and stem rot also tend to be quite common. I'd say those are common pests and diseases you'll find in your crop, but hopefully you don't find them, obviously.
I noticed that you did touch more on diseases, but are there any specific pests that one is more likely to come across?
Thrips, I think, are inevitable in most setups. They just appear in almost all setups. Thrips are quite common, and fungus gnats, which seem to come from the cocoa coir itself or outside sources, also seem to be quite a common insect. But they're not detrimental to the quality of the plant if obviously kept under control. So a good IPM program will allow you to really keep everything under control. Lots of plant inspections, those sort of things. It'll be all good.
You did say IPM, and just for our listeners, that would be an integrated pest control management. What would that be?
So integrated pest management is more of a holistic approach to your pesticides and combating. So instead of just going out there and spraying all sorts of chemicals, it's like a combined approach, which involves plant scouting and bait traps and sticky traps. From that, you can really gain a proper understanding of what your plants are struggling with. And from then onwards, you can sort of tailor pick the right product to use, ideally an organic product. It's more about inspecting and monitoring than spraying. And that really allows you to not overdo spraying and spray hazardous chemicals. And especially because this is a medicine, you don't want to be spraying things that could be of a detriment to someone else, but also you do want to keep the insects and biological content under control. It's a bit of a tough one to juggle, but I think IPM really helps to solve that.
We've spoken about the growth stages, diseases, and the ideal medium and environment for medicinal cannabis. But how do you know when it's ready? What does harvest look like?
For harvesting, it's all about timing. you'll start to notice in the flowers that they've got these things called pistils, or we call them hairs, and they go from a white color to a very brown sort of color. You'll start to notice that the leaves start to turn yellow because all the nutrients and energy is focused on the bud development and ripening. And eventually it gets to a point where the plant is going into senescence, which is, death basically, but for plants. On top of that, there's like a tool that we use, a jeweler's loop, what jewelers use for like diamonds and those kind of things. You can inspect up close on the flowers, and there's these small things called trichomes on the buds. Those trichomes often start out as like a clear, glassy color, but towards the end of the plant's life cycle, they turn to more of a milky white or amber color. And that's when you know that your plant is ready to harvest.
I guess South Africa is also moving into sustainable development, and you did mention how water efficient this crop is. What else can you tell us about the sustainable practices that you implement in terms of this crop, and, why would you consider it a sustainable crop for South Africa?
I think good practices going forward, obviously I mentioned the IPM program. That's one way to really reduce the amount of chemicals you're spraying. Another thing would be renewable energy, because this sort of controlled environment agriculture setup is quite energy intensive. I think go renewable solar or any other form of energy would really be a good way to start it out. Water recycling and rainwater harvesting, because yes, the plant is water efficient, but also because we're trying to grow big plants, we're using a lot of water on the flip side. So to reuse that water and recirculate it, similar to what I mentioned earlier in the hydroponic setup. And if you can recirculate and reuse that water, that'll also really count towards your sustainable brownie points.
Is there anything else that maybe we haven't touched on in terms of the legal considerations for cannabis cultivation? Because it is quite a controversial crop as it is.
It's governed by quite a mix of national laws and court rulings. And as much as there's been quite a progress towards legalization, it's quite important, I think, to know the landscape of the legality, really to just ensure compliance. So like I mentioned earlier, your licensing requirements, that's like a very important thing to consider. And then to export your product, the cannabis, you still need to comply with the SAPRA regulations as well as your international trade laws. And then on top of that, as with any other agricultural operation, you need to adhere to your GACP, your good agricultural and collection practices, and your good manufacturing practices. And one last thing is a very detailed records of cultivation practices, your pesticide use, plant tracking for traceability, those sort of things really. It is a very stringent and regulated environment. The best is just to be compliant with all the measures, and it will really help in the long run.
Record keeping is just very important in any agricultural enterprise. Are there any facts that you'd want to share with us about cannabis production? Anything interesting that you've come across? Perhaps what your hopes are for the cultivation of this crop in South Africa?
I see it going a really positive direction. We're sort of positioning ourselves as a global exporter for this product. And I think a lot of countries are looking to South Africa to supply. And I think this really counts towards our agricultural exports going forward. So that's something to really be positive about. On top of that, it's really creating a lot of employment and upskilling. You get the experience in agriculture, but then to be pulled into a controlled environment where it really broadens your mindset and really allows you to understand a different way of agriculture, a different way of doing things compared to your standard practices. So it's really cool in terms of that. I think a fun fact that I'd like to mention is that if you grow your cannabis in a living soil, something I mentioned earlier, what it does effectively is it's similar to like growing wine. The soil allows for the flavor and the aroma to really develop in the plant. I'm a big advocate for living soil and those sort of amendments.
Thank you so much, Alec Yardley, Production Supervisor at Karoo Bioscience. For more information on this topic, please visit www.foodformzansi.co.za. And that's a wrap. Remember to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platforms. From me, Patricia Tembo, our technical producer, Megan van der Vent, and the rest of #team Foodformzansi, thank you for listening.
Life in South Africa can be a lot. I mean, scroll through Twitter for a minute and tell me I'm wrong. Thank God for South Africans though, right? We're inspiring, and even on the bad days, we fight back with a smile. That's why I love Foodformzansi so much. They're not ashamed to celebrate the ordinary unsung heroes who work every day to put food on our nation's tables. Go to foodformzansi.co.za and never miss an inspiring story.